the Philippines have been holding their first bilateral consultation on the South China Sea after their presidents reached a consensus on resolving the South China Sea issue through dialogue. We'll be looking at the significance of this first meeting. And as President Donald Trump prepares for his first overseas trip since taking office, we'll be asking what can be expected of him given the domestic troubles he's facing on almost a daily basis. Welcome to The Point. I'm Li Xin. China and the Philippines held the first meeting of the bilateral consultation mechanism on the South China Sea issue today, Friday, in the southwestern Chinese city of Guiyang. This comes a few days after Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte finished his trip to the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. While in Beijing, Duterte and Chinese President Xi Jinping once again reached consensus on resolving the South China Sea issue through dialogue and consultation. For the first round of talks, the Chinese delegation is headed by Vice Foreign Minister Liu Zhenming, and leading the Philippines delegation is Philippines Ambassador to China, Chito Santa Romana. So what's the significance of this meeting? I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Zhu Feng, Executive Director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea at Nanjing University. Professor Zhu, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, sure.
Well, China has been seeking the opportunity to talk to the Philippines face-to-face, bilaterally, to resolve the South China Sea for a while now, but it had not been successful. Finally, this first meeting, face-to-face meeting, is taking place. What is the significance of this meeting?
Of course, I think the significance is very remarkable. First of all, we will see it's some sort of bigger signal. Beijing and Manila eventually agree to revitalize some sort of, let's say, bilateral negotiation to address their frictions and disputes over the South China Seas, territorial disputes, and even the maritime, let's say, the rights. I think this signal, of course, is mean a lot of things about improved, particularly very significantly improved political relations between Beijing and Manila. Then it's also indicating, we say, the diplomatic pragmatism hitting back. Because we also know a couple of years ago, so then some sort of international arbitration driven the disruption is really threatening the bilateral relations and even the stability of the South China Sea. But now both sides eventually just sitting down. They're using a very pragmatic notion, as we just heard, as some sort of a consulting mechanism. So then I see some sort of lot of, we say, progress of the both capitals has made. It's also some sort of a new demonstration of the good willingness. We can very firmly and very clearly identify from the current improved relations between Beijing and Manila.
Indeed, as you mentioned, we all remember the big drama surrounding started from 2013 and almost lasting 3 years until summer of last year. Now, what could possibly come out of this meeting or come out of a series of such bilateral consultations? Can we expect anything concrete this time?
Of course, I think some sort of new beginning of the bilateral talk will be some sort of very fruitful and productive, starting point. But the problem is on how it could be just let's say, turning into some sort of a concrete, the discussion and the negotiation. Then what kind of things we can expect, very specific and detailed. It will take a time, but the problem signal is very strong and very identical.
What kind of compromise could possibly be struck between the two sides? Will they agree to maintain the status quo, not to expand militarily, or could they really come to an agreement to a maritime demarcation deal?
Good question. I think status quo maintaining is not enough. So far, I see the Beijing and Manila also, we say, showing a strong, some sort of a will to maintain the status quo. Most important is, where is the status quo at hand? What kind of the new breakthrough both sides could expectably, we say, achieve? So one point is, we can getting back to the joint development over some sort of, we say, gas and oil in the disputed water areas. If both sides could quickly just agree on some sort of new methodology of how we say joint development could just restored, I consider it will be remarkable, step forward.
Actually, you mentioned joint exploitation of natural resources. The latest news, we know that Duterte is very much interested in jointly exploring the oil resources with China and Vietnam. Do you think there are some concrete result could come to fruition in the near future in this regard?
Yes, if we looking back the past 25 years of the Spratly Island dispute-based some sort of international response, where we found it's not a China only. Then some sort of climate stage, including the Philippines and the Vietnam, they also agree one after another on some sort of a pragmatism in handling the disputes. I think one of the key elements is joint development, because it could be very smartly and wisely keep some sort of disputes just shelved. On the other hand, outstand what kind of a common goal, common good, and a common achievement could just available to either side. So from this point, I think the joint development now is not just a bigger rhetoric. That will be some sort of a new incarnation of the upcoming fruits all both sides could achieve.
Could it be an example of China's way of handling this disputes with other countries?
Of course, if back to the end of the 80s, then we will see the former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping also very powerfully demonstrate some sort of the Chinese strategic vision on how disputes could be settled. I think his main point is let's just work on the joint development, because it could benefit all the sides and also lay out some sort of, we say, pragmatic path to get the coordination and cooperation become some sort of a usual things.
Finally, some concern by some Western media is that China is so big, Philippines is much smaller compared in size. Will the two sides be really able to sit down and have an equal footing in negotiation?
Of course, I think no matter bigger and small a country is, according to the international norm, we are all equal. We are all at the same footprint to claim according to the international law. So from this point, I think China is fully respect the Philippines as a sovereign state. So both of us could own some sort of a very equal, the position to negotiate the common achievements what will be on horizon right now.
Well, we'll keep a close watch on that development. Thank you very much, Professor Zhu Feng, Executive Director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea at Nanjing University. You're watching The Point here on CGTN. We'll be back right after the short break, and we'll get a different perspective on this issue. Stay with me. Welcome back. To get more insight on the significance of the first meeting of the bilateral consultation mechanism on the South China Sea issue between China and the Philippines, I'm also pleased to be joined in the studio by Jaime Flor-Cruz, professor at the School of Journalism of Peking University and also former CNN Beijing bureau chief. Jaime, thank you very much for joining me today. Now, what do you think has driven the Philippine President Duterte to change or to let's say, adjust the policy of his predecessor, Aquino, by agreeing to talks this time?
Yeah, so we've had frosty relations with China for many years until President Rodrigo Duterte came to power. His view is very simple. War is not an option. War with China is not an option. We will not win. No one wins in a war. And therefore, he decided we'll take a pragmatic approach. We won the arbitral ruling over the conflicting claims over the islands in South China Sea. And so he believes, it's there. It's in the legal world right now. But in spite of that, he decided the Philippines will pursue a pragmatic relations with China, break the ice, and so he sent a special envoy here, and that started the warming up of relations. His point is the Philippines is not giving up its claims over those islands, but let's set it aside, and we will pursue pragmatic relations, with China on trade, business, commercial, and other infrastructure projects.
Well, he definitely showed a very big interest after the talks or after attending the Belt and Road Initiative Forum in Beijing, where Chinese leadership promised additional resources to put in building infrastructure with surrounding countries. However, we have seen conflicting signals coming out of the Duterte administration. Most recently, we see the Philippines Defense Secretary together with Chief of the Armed Forces visiting one of the disputed islands in the South China Sea, or what you call the West Philippine Sea, and making really strong assertion that this is the territory of the Philippines. How can we understand this? For instance, the visit, was it blessed by President Duterte? If so, why?
There probably was a tacit blessing on the part of Duterte. Why? Duterte's policy towards China has its own set of critics. There are detractors, there are opponents of the initiative towards China, and so Duterte needs to take care of them, including those in the army, the Philippine army. They feel like they have been disadvantaged in terms of the buildup, military buildup in these islands and around them, and also Duterte needs to show that he cares for the well-being of the people working in the military. And that is one of the reasons why Lorenzana, the defense minister, did what he did.
Well, what about the domestic mood, domestic public opinion on this issue? I mean, we understand that during the past few years, especially when the ruling that we talked about just came out last year, there was a lot of very dramatic voices in the Philippines demanding China to respect that ruling. What is the public opinion at this moment?
In the public opinion among the intellectuals, the middle class, in the media, they are critical of the current policy of President Duterte towards China. But he enjoys, wide popular support. Some 70% of the people in a recent survey show that
possible?
Well, he has projected himself as a populist president. He cares for the well-being of the people. He says he wants to bring peace and prosperity towards the people. And so the ordinary Filipinos support such a program. On China, again, I think his followers are willing to give him a chance to succeed on this front.
Mm-hmm. However, given the kind of volatility, we've also heard about requests for impeachment, for instance, for President Duterte. Of course, we hope that is not going to happen anytime soon. But, when you hear this kind of request, you know how much pressure he's faced with. Is that kind of political pressure going to take the wind out of the first ever bilateral talk between China and the Philippines?
It all depends on how strong he remains as a leader in the Philippines. Yes, there are critics, he has detractors, he has political opponents, and some of them think that the way he's proceeding in relations with China makes him a traitor, that he's giving up the Philippine sovereignty. But again, he is a very strong leader. He is he does what he wants. He doesn't care what other people say, which makes him a very decisive one. But he must take care of his other flanks, otherwise he could be deposed.
Mm-hmm. What is the Philippines' expectation of this meeting, or is it really just a symbolic gesture?
It is the beginning of a long process, a long march, the first step of a long march. I mean, the good news is that the Philippine delegation is led by a China expert. Chito Santaramana knows China inside out. I'm biased, he's a good friend, but that's good. We are in good hands, and I think that it takes two to tango, and there are intractable issues that they need to deal with in these talks. I would manage our expectation that there will be no big breakthroughs. I think from the Philippine side, the hope is that we can at least agree to assure the fishermen, say in the Spratly Islands, that they will be able to keep their livelihood without interference or harassment from each other's like military. We also hope that the Philippines hopes that the China's Coast Guard, for example, can go further away in their patrolling of these islands so that there'll be peace.
But so long as there is a beginning of rebuilding of political trust, I think technical issues could be discussed.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Jaime Flor Cruz, professor at the School of Journalism from Peking University. You have been watching The Point with me here on CGTN. I'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. U.S. President Donald Trump will shortly be making his first overseas trip since taking office. He will be visiting Israel, the Vatican and Saudi Arabia before attending a NATO meeting in Belgium and a Group of 7 summit in Italy. The choice of Israel and Saudi Arabia has drawn particular attention as the two are traditional enemies but are also both allies to the United States. To help us understand the potential change or continuity of his policies with regard to those of Trump's predecessor, I talked to John Feiner, resident fellow of the Institute of Politics at Harvard University, who was in Beijing attending a seminar on China and the U.S. in the Middle East. I started by asking him about the opportunities for cooperation the U.S. and China can have with regards to that region of the world.
There is already a track record of some cooperation between China and the United States to solve a big problem in the Middle East, and that's the Iran nuclear threat. So obviously both China and the United States participated in the P5+1 negotiations, worked very closely together, and were able, with the help of other countries and other partners, to address and resolve that issue peacefully without any conflict and any war. And China's role in the Iran nuclear deal is critical, especially with regard to the Arak nuclear reactor in Iran. Whether they can extend that cooperation to other issues, I think, remains to be seen. As you said, the Belt and Road Initiative may actually offer an opportunity for the United States and China, or at least for American companies and China, to work to address some of the infrastructure needs of the region. And I would encourage the United States not to look too skeptically or with too much suspicion of Belt and Road, and actually to see it as a potential opportunity for the United States.
A fair point. Now, for the U.S.'s policy in the Middle East, where do you see President Trump going? We have seen back and forth, for instance, on the question of the one-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Now he seems to have, again, stepped back, but he seems to want to make peace in that region. Where is his policy going from what we have seen so far?
So what I think we see so far is more continuity than we might expect in a few areas. On counterterrorism, Trump was quite critical of President Obama's approach to the ISIS problem in the Middle East. He ordered a new strategy, a new review, and his administration gave him back a strategy that looked very much like the approach that President Obama was taking, so a lot of continuity there. On Iran, President Trump, when he was a candidate, was quite critical, as you know, of the Iran nuclear deal, but so far he has signaled his intention to remain in the deal, and the State Department has certified that Iran is complying with the deal. Even on Israel and Palestine, which you just remarked on, I think so far there has been a higher degree of continuity from President Trump than we might have expected. He has been critical of the Israelis on settlement construction, and he has welcomed Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to Washington just in recent days. So I think in terms of what they're doing, there's a lot of continuity. In terms of what they're saying, I think you're seeing a high degree of really aggressive rhetoric, and sometimes descriptions of the policy from different senior officials that differ from what the president says. And so I think the concern that some of us have is a lack of clarity, a lack of coherence as to their policy approach.
You're working under former Secretary of State John Kerry, especially during the deal that the United States struck with Russia in dealing with the serious chemical weapons issue. Do you think there will be this kind of red line being drawn again under President Trump when it comes to any possible strong action in response to Syria or the Syrian government's any future possible use of chemical weapons?
Well, I mentioned earlier that there has been some areas of continuity where we thought there might be change. There have also been some change where we might have expected continuity from the new administration, and Syria is a good example. President Trump signaled during the campaign that he was not supportive of increased U.S. military activity in the Middle East, that he thought the Iraq War was a bad idea, even though at the time he had supported it, and that he would not get the United States involved more deeply in military conflicts. But as
he did drop the 59 Scud missiles in Syria.
Yes, so that was during the campaign. As president, President Trump has actually taken significant steps towards greater U.S. military involvement in the region. The best example, as you indicated, is the missile attack on the Assad regime in response to the use of chemical weapons. But he has also increased U.S. military activity in Iraq, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and even in places like Somalia. So there are some examples here of increased military activity where we might have thought the administration would not intervene as much as they have.
Let's come back to Syria,
Sure.
because again, we have this meeting that's being held by Russia, by Iran, and by Turkey, where they even signed an agreement to set up kind of a de-escalation zone in Syria. How does the United States look at this development now?
Well, it's interesting. The United States was present at this meeting, but was not a direct participant in this meeting. Its status was that of an observer to the agreement. So I think the American government is still sort of studying the agreement to determine what exactly it says and whether it is a viable approach. My concern is that it is hard to imagine an agreement that can be implemented effectively that doesn't involve the United States, and frankly, it doesn't involve some other countries that are involved in this conflict, particularly the Gulf countries, which provide a high degree of support to the Syrian opposition. I welcome Russian, Turkish, and Iranian leadership in trying to address what is the worst crisis anywhere on the planet, the worst humanitarian crisis and the worst conflict. But I do think it is going to require buy-in from other countries, including the United States, to make this work. There have been a lot of agreements on Syria, and not a lot of them have been successful.
No, and maybe that's precisely the reason why the United States is not involved. I mean, the last time the United States and Russia struck some kind of an agreement, and it again fell through. But how do you think would be a reasonable stepping stone for the United States to come back into the negotiating table, not as an observer? What would have to happen?
Well, one thing I think that would have to happen is for the new administration, the Trump administration, to prioritize ending the Syrian conflict as a policy priority. So far, if you chalked up the administration's policy priorities in Syria, you would have to say that they are focused exclusively on ISIS and on defeating ISIS. That was President Obama's policy and priority as well. But President Obama also focused a lot of time, energy, and attention, and Secretary Kerry in particular focused a lot of time and energy on addressing the underlying conflict. My sense is that you cannot defeat ISIS over the long run as long as the underlying Syrian civil war continues to rage, and it would be good if the Trump administration, Secretary Tillerson, and President Trump started to prioritize ending that war as well.
Do you think President Trump would one day accept the fate of President Assad as the new and the continuous leader of Syria, if there is peace?
Well, we'll have to see. The new administration has said a lot of things about President Assad. At one point, they seemed to indicate they saw no possibility for him to depart. Pretty soon after the chemical weapons attack, they started to say some pretty strong, pretty negative things about President Assad. So I think that this is one of those areas in which a greater degree of clarity as to what the new administration's position is would be helpful to those of us trying to interpret it, as well as to the parties trying to end the conflict.
What is the current state of the U.S. foreign policy bureaucracy, let's say the State Department? We have all these voices of dissent, which probably by now has already been channeled properly, but there is also this lack of personnel and the slashing of funding that we have heard talking about. Is that going to affect the U.S.'s foreign policy and also the implementation of the policy in the future?
I think it will affect American foreign policy. What you're seeing is a new administration that seems to value and prioritize military advice and the use of military power as a tool in making foreign policy. President Trump has said, I'm going to give a lot of deference, a lot of autonomy to my military commanders, and he has surrounded himself with a lot of advisors who have a military background or who are current military officers. On the other side of the coin, diplomacy and development have gotten a shorter shrift from the new administration. He has not empowered his diplomats, and in fact, he has left a number of very important senior positions unfilled at the State Department. I think that is unfortunate. I think that is going to make diplomatic follow-up to some of the positions he is taking and some of the policies he wants to pursue very difficult if you don't have the personnel in place to do that hard work.
Finally, you also worked very extensively as a journalist, and you've written a lot of front-page stories. How do you look at the kind of relationship between the press, especially between the liberal press, with the with President Trump at this moment? Is that conducive? I mean, we see this fighting, this quarreling almost on a daily basis on some of the TV stations.
Well, I think it's important to point out we have a very free and vigorous press in the United States that has, on many occasions, I think, angered the president by some of its reports, and I suspect it will continue to hold the administration.
And vice versa, the president has also angered some of the
Absolutely, and I think the press will continue to hold the new administration accountable for its statements and for its policies as well it should. I personally have found discouraging, and I think a number of reporters and people who care about journalism and press in the country have found discouraging some of the statements made by the president about the role of the press. That said, the president is a pretty savvy operator. On the one hand, he may be criticizing reporters. On the other hand, he is bringing them in to his confidence and providing interviews and that sort of thing. I think the most important thing to underscore is that a free and vigorous press is essential to the functioning of American society, and I would argue other societies, and that is going to continue.
Thank you very much, John Feiner, resident fellow with the Institute of Politics with Harvard University.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And here is my last point. Both President Donald Trump and President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines are trying to carve out successful foreign policies amid difficult, if not tumultuous, domestic issues. In Trump's case, the media, or the liberal media, seem to be holding a vendetta and are out to get him. He's wrapped up in so many political troubles at home that it's impossible to imagine he can expect to achieve much during his first overseas trip. In the Philippines, however, the media are, in the main, much more balanced in their coverage of Duterte, who has a record of talking tough but also delivering. This gives Duterte more room for maneuver and also a greater chance of success when talking with his Chinese counterparts. Trump's lack of political experience is part of the reason he is regarded as a lightweight president by many, and whether he will be given the chance to fulfill his first political position is very much open to doubt. But maybe he will yet surprise us all. I wouldn't write him off just yet. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on CGTN.